Hi, back again. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about the law of one price. This applies to a lot of products, but it is most applicable to a commodity. A commodity is something that doesn't vary from producer to producer. So a good example of a commodity might be oil. So let's imagine that we live in a world where the United States produces and consumes oil, and Saudi Arabia produces and consumes oil, but they're not trading with each other. And let's imagine that because these two countries are selling the oil they produce only in their home country, in the United States, the price of oil would be relatively high compared to the price of oil in Saudi Arabia, and that's because all the easy oil was pulled out of the ground decades ago. The oil age started in the 1860s, and it's been going ever since. And here in the United States, all the cheap oil was found a long, long time ago. So now we do produce a lot of oil, more than anybody else, but it tends to be more expensive oil. Oil in places like the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, or that they have to frack for. So if we were relying only on the oil that we produce, we'd be paying a higher price, let's say PUS up here. Now, Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a lot of oil, but their domestic market for oil is relatively small. Their population is small. People do drive, but they don't drive as much as we do. And the oil that they have available to them is very inexpensive to get at. They've got big, large pools of oil, and they don't have to do very much to get at that oil. So let's imagine that the price of oil in Saudi Arabia is way down here at PSA. So the story that I'm going to tell is that when Saudi Arabia and the United States starts trading with each other, eventually what's going to happen is we're going to wind up over here at PW. Everybody who is in the market for oil, either as a buyer or seller, will pay or receive PW. And that's the world price. So we'll go through the steps of how we get from PUS in the United States to PW, and PSA in Saudi Arabia to PW over here. All right, so you have to imagine that if you're a buyer of oil in the United States, now now you have the opportunity to trade with somebody in Saudi Arabia who's selling their oil at PSA, or buy it from somebody in the United States at PUS. You're probably going to buy your oil from Saudi Arabia because it's much cheaper. So what that's going to do is that's going to push down the price of oil in the United States, and that's going to raise the price of oil in Saudi Arabia, right? Because if you're a seller of oil, and before you started trading with the United States, your seller of oil in Saudi Arabia, before you start trading with the United States, you were able to get PSA over here. And now you have the opportunity to sell your oil for PUS over here. That's kind of a no-brainer. You're going to sell it to people in the United States at a higher price. So the price in Saudi Arabia is going to rise, and eventually we're going to reach some kind of equilibrium, and there's going to be one price for oil. In other words, everybody who buys oil is going to come into the market along the demand curve. Everybody who produces and sells oil will come into the market, and that'll be the world supply curve, and there'll be one price for oil determined by supply and demand. Okay, so now if everybody in the world is either selling their oil or buying their oil at PW, it looks like we would have a problem. It looks like in the United States we would have a shortage because domestic quantity demanded, we're going to call that QDD, is greater than domestic quantity supplied, which we'll call QDS. But there's no shortage, and the difference between domestic quantity demanded and domestic quantity supplied is imports. So at this lower price, U.S. domestic producers are not as competitive, so people will be able to buy some domestically produced oil, but some of it's going to be coming from Saudi Arabia as well. All right, what about in Saudi Arabia? Well, it looks like at a price of PW that they would have a surplus. Why do we say that? Because domestic quantity supplied, QDS, is greater than domestic quantity demanded. But there's no surplus. The difference between these two is exports. Now, you have to imagine that if the United States and Saudi Arabia are the only two countries, then the amount of imports is going to be equal to the amount of exports. I know that doesn't show that here on the graphs, but bear with me. Just imagine that that's what's going on, and so we're importing the exact same amount as Saudi Arabia is exporting. All right, so now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time with consumer surplus and producer surplus to look at how people are doing in the two countries. So now the first thing we're doing is we're looking at it from the point of view of the exporting country. So what makes Saudi Arabia the exporting country? It's pre-trade price. Before Saudi Arabia and the United States started buying and selling oil to one another, the price of oil in Saudi Arabia was less than the price of oil in the United States, which would indicate that they probably have some kind of a comparative advantage, which would make it likely that they would be an exporter of oil. All right, so let's imagine that before Saudi Arabia started selling oil to people in other countries, they were restricted to their domestic market. The price in the domestic market was PSA. We've got all these letters over here that represent different portions of or what we call surplus. So for example, A is this triangle, B is this rectangle, E is this little triangle here, F is this little triangle here, C is this trapezoid thing, I think that's what it's called, and D is this triangle over here. So before Saudi Arabia started trading with the United States, the price in Saudi Arabia was PSA, and supply and demand determine the equilibrium quantity. Now that Saudi Arabia is trading with the US, the price is going to rise from PSA to PW. So what impact is this going to have on consumer and producer surplus? Well, before Saudi Arabia started trading with the United States, consumer surplus was the area below the demand curve, above PSA out to the quantity, which would be the equilibrium quantity where supply and demand intersect. So it would be areas A, B, and E. All right, what about domestic producer surplus in Saudi Arabia? Well, domestic producer surplus would be the area above the supply curve out to the equilibrium quantity, so it would be C and F. Now, when Saudi Arabia starts trading with the United States, the price is going to go from PSA to PW. So what happens to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus in the exporting country gets reduced. Now consumer surplus is only A, this area over here, and B and E get transferred to domestic producers. So domestic producers in the exporting country are better off because now they not only had C and F like they did before, but they have B, E, and D. So what is D over here? I mean, D is outside of the demand curve. Well, D is the amount of additional surplus available to the country as a result of trade. It's a gain from trade, if you will. So consumers are made worse off because they lost B and E. Conceivably, what they could do is they could take B and E away from producers and transfer it back to consumers, and producers would still be better off because now they have C, F, and D. But the country on balance is better off because it picked up area D. That doesn't mean that everybody in the country is better off as a result of it, but again, on balance, the country's picked up an area that they didn't have before. This surplus over here, this triangle we call D. All right, what about in the United States? So what you have to imagine is before the U.S. started trading oil with Saudi Arabia, the price in the United States was PUS. Consumer surplus is given by this area A over here. What about producer surplus? Producer surplus was this triangle C plus this rectangle B plus this triangle E over here. So it's everything above the supply curve and below PUS. Now, when the United States starts trading with Saudi Arabia, the price drops from PUS to PW. How is this going to affect consumer and producer surplus? Well, let's look at producers first. Producers in the importing country wind up losing. Why is that? Because now, if the price is PW, the only thing we have for producer surplus is area C over here. So before it was C, B, and E, now it's just area C. So producers are worse off in the importing country, domestic producers. What about consumers in the importing country? Well, they're better off. They had A to begin with. They picked up area B and area E, which used to belong to domestic producers of oil, and they also picked up area D, which didn't exist before. So what is D? D is the gain from trade for the importing country. So why is it a gain from trade? Because it's below the demand curve, so it makes it part of consumer surplus. It's above the price, and it's an area that would not have been part of consumer surplus if, in this case, the United States was forced to buy oil from only its domestic producers. So the country is better off on balance because it picked up area D. It doesn't mean that everybody's better off. The domestic oil producers are worse off because they lost B and E. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that because of the way oil is produced in a global market and the fact that U.S. oil producers don't just produce in the United States, they produce in different countries. But for the sake of illustrating the economic theory, we're just going to assume that oil producers in the United States produce in the U.S. and they don't produce anywhere else. Does that make sense? All right, so this is an article that's talking about something that happened back in 2007 that had to do with our subsidizing corn that goes into ethanol. So, ethanol is just basically alcohol. Alcohol is something that the oil companies are forced to blend in with their gasoline. A lot of people think this is a rule that was created by George W. Bush, Bush 43, when he was elected. A lot of people think that he was buddy buddy with the oil company, and that's oil companies, and that's the reason why he pushed for ethanol made from corn to be blended with gasoline. The oil companies absolutely hate this. They don't. They know how to make gasoline. They've been doing it for a long time, 150 years or more, and they don't need to be told whether or not they should be blending in ethanol with their gasoline. This is done as a political move, mostly to get higher corn prices for corn producers in the middle of the country. If you think of the electoral map, those are the states that are usually red. And so, if you win those states and you've got people in those states that are looking for higher prices, then why not throw them a bone? Why not help them out by making the oil companies blend in ethanol from corn? It had to be from corn. You can make ethanol from anything because it's an alcohol, right? Anything that has a sugar will make an alcohol. But no, the rule was it had to be made from corn. Well, why are we talking about Mexico here? We've got this article talking about how corn tortilla prices in Mexico went up. Well, what happened was when this rule was implemented, it increased the demand for corn that would go into ethanol, and it reduced the supply of corn that would go into making food like tortillas. So the price of tortillas in Mexico went up as a result of the increase in the price of corn in the United States going up because of ethanol. So, another thing that was interesting about this article was you would think that being that corn is a food, corn tortillas is a food, that the price elasticity demand would be very elastic, meaning that or inelastic, excuse me, meaning that a big increase in the price would lead to a small decrease in quantity demanded. After all, we all have to eat food, right? It turns out, though, that this increase actually showed that it was very elastic. In other words, a 1% increase in the price of corn led to a greater than 1% decrease in quantity demanded. So a lot of people are saying, well, maybe people in Mexico are doing without corn now that corn tortillas, now that corn prices are higher as a result of this requirement that ethanol from corn be blended in with gasoline. All right, so what are some examples of restrictions on trade? We're actually going to talk about two of them. We're going to talk about, well, maybe three. We're going to talk about a tariff, a quota, and a little bit on a voluntary export restraint. So let's go down the list. An embargo is a law that prohibits trade with another country. So we still currently have embargoes on Cuba. You're not supposed to either buy or sell anything from Cuba. There's certain exceptions, but it's really hard to get those exceptions. We also have embargoes against North Korea, and we have embargoes against Iran, which we're tightening at the moment. So, in other words, people in the United States are not supposed to trade with those people. A tariff is a specific tax on imported goods. So, as the Trump administration has been imposing more tariffs, those taxes are only on those goods imported into the United States. And so it stands to reason that the person who's importing it into the United States has to pay this tax, and then they'll probably pass or try to pass along some of that tariff to the buyer, of course. So ultimately, the buyer of the good winds up paying a higher price. An export tax that isn't used that much these days in developed countries, but in the United States, before we became kind of an industrialized country, a lot of the money the federal government relied on came in the form of export taxes. We'd export things like cotton and tobacco, a lot of agricultural products. The reason some countries have export taxes is because they're easy to impose. All you need is somebody counting, let's say, the number of bales of cotton being loaded onto a ship or bales of tobacco. You put a tax on each one of those, and that's how you raise your money. If you think about what's required to have, let's say, an income tax, you need a lot more infrastructure for an income tax. All right, non-tariff barriers to trade, what are we talking about? One example would be a quota. In the context of trade, a quota is a numerical restriction on the amount of a good that can be imported. So we in the past, what they wanted to do was they wanted to take quotas, turn them into tariffs, equivalent tariffs, and then try to bring down the tariff rates. There are still some products that are subject to quota, even though there was this big push to convert quotas into tariffs. A good example of products that are under quota are textiles. If you ever buy, like, let's say, three of the same pair of blue jeans, and you bother to look at the labels, let's say where they're made, you might be surprised that they're made in different countries. So why does, let's say, Levi's make some blue jeans in Bangladesh and other Levi's, let's say, in El Salvador, and maybe other Levi's in Vietnam or something like that? They do that because each country has a specific quota, and they cannot import more than a certain amount of, let's say, blue jeans from, I don't know, Vietnam. So once Levi's hits its quota there, they've got to look to another country to make blue jeans that they can bring in under some other quota. A voluntary export restraint, I put voluntary in quotes, is something where an exporting country voluntarily agrees to not export as much as they could. Why do I put voluntary in quotes? Because it's not really voluntary. It's more like this country is doing this because they're trying to help out their trading partner that is not too happy with all of these goods flooding their domestic market. So the reason they would do that, though, is because maybe the country that's importing so much of this good is telling them, look, if you don't rein in your imports, your exports to us, if you don't get your exporters to reduce the amount that they're sending to us, maybe we'll hit you up with a tariff or a quota, and that would work out worse. So, for instance, we had a voluntary export restraint with Japan in the early 1980s on automobiles because the Japanese automakers, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, those are the big three in Japan. They were exporting a lot of cars to the United States, and GM, Ford, and Chrysler weren't too happy about that. Other restrictions on trade, I'm not going to get into this too much. In fact, not at all. I'm just going to skip through this. It won't be on the exam, but there are countries. The only thing I want to point out is countries look for creative ways if they're prohibited, let's say, from imposing a tariff or a quota or something like that, they can look for other creative ways of trying to restrict the amount of goods being imported into a country. All right, so what I want to do over here is talk about what happens when a country is, let's say, going from not importing a good from others to importing that good. So let's imagine we're talking about the United States. Let's imagine that the domestic price in the United States is up here. And let's imagine that the United States is relatively small compared to the world market. I realize this graph is bigger than the other graph over here for the world market, but you have to imagine that the quantities over here are in the US are in millions, and the quantities in the world market are in hundreds of millions. So if people in other countries have a comparative advantage producing this good, it'll show up as a lower price. So let's just imagine that the world price is down here, the pre-trade domestic price is PD over here. Let's imagine now that because the United States has a higher price, when they start trading with other countries, they're going to wind up being an importer. How is this going to affect domestic consumers and domestic producers? Well, now that PW is the price that exists in the US domestic market, domestic producers will move up the supply curve from left to right, and they'll keep going until they encounter PW. Then we can drop a line down here to the quantity axis, and this would be domestic quantities supplied over here. Well, what about domestic consumers? Domestic consumers like lower prices, right? Whether you love Walmart or hate Walmart, you have to admit that Walmart did not become this big, gigantic retailer that they are by by making everybody pay everyday high prices. They know that consumers like everyday low prices. So if the price were to drop from PD to PW over here, consumers would move all the way down the demand curve until we encounter PW. And then we can drop a line down here to the quantity axis, and this would be domestic quantity demanded. So it looks like there's a shortage, but there's no shortage. The difference between domestic quantity demanded, QDD, and domestic quantity supplied, QDS, is going to be imports. So now imagine that you are a domestic producer in this market, and you used to get PD, this price over here, and you used to sell QD, you used to get this quantity over here, and now you're forced to compete against PW. And because PW is so much lower than PD, you now are only able to sell this much, QDS. All right, now imagine that you're a buyer, a consumer of this good in the United States. You used to be forced to pay PD over here, but now you can pick up the good for PW. So you're going to slide down the demand curve. When you get to PW, we drop a line down here to the quantity axis, and this is QDD, domestic quantity demanded. So the difference between QDD and QDS, domestic quantity demanded, domestic quantity supplied, is the amount being imported. You're a producer of this good. You're not too happy because you're forced to pay a lower price and you're selling less of your good. So what might you do to counter that? Well, maybe what you would do is, you know what they say, if you don't like it, write your congressman. And in the old days, people would write a letter, believe it or not, because we didn't have email. So maybe this person goes beyond writing a letter, right? I mean, if you write an email to your congressman, you'll get some kind of auto reply saying, thank you very much, we appreciate your input, blah, 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 blah. But you're probably not going to get a lot of traction. On the other hand, if you contribute to your congressman's campaign, and if you contribute enough money to your congressman's campaign, maybe he'll even put you in his cell phone. You'll be on speed dial, right? So imagine that, these producers are not too happy with this. Imagine that they get the ear of their congressman, and imagine that their congressman also is able to effectively get a tariff imposed on this product. So what's going to happen is the prices here at PW, this is before the tariff is imposed. Again, QDD, domestic quantity demanded, is the amount that's being imported. QDS, domestic quantity supplied, is the amount that is being produced in the home country, in the importing country. But now the price is going to rise from PW to PW plus T. The plus T is the tariff. And so what's that going to do to the domestic market, the market where people are importing this good? Well, because the price is now PW plus T instead of PW, it'll allow domestic producers to compete against a higher price. So domestic quantity demanded will rise from QDS to QDST. QDST is the amount of domestic quantity supplied with the tariff. Okay, so domestic producers are going to be able to sell more. How is that going to affect consumers though? Well, before the tariff, the price was PW and domestic quantity demanded was QDD. Now that the price is rising to PW plus T, domestic consumers are going to buy less. So we're going to actually move up the demand curve over here in this direction, and we drop a line down to QDDT. So this is domestic quantity demanded with the tariff. And so what you see is that domestic consumers are buying less and paying a higher price for the good that they're buying. Okay, so that's what's happening as a result of this tariff. Let's take a look at consumer surplus and producer surplus. So instead of looking at letters for a consumer surplus, I've put numbers down here. So 1 is this funky shape thing over here. 2 is this triangle between the supply curve and the demand curve. 3 is this, I believe that's a trapezoid, this trapezoid thing here over here. 4 is a rectangle. 5 is this, 4 is a triangle. It has 3 angles, not 4. 5 is a rectangle, 6 is a triangle, and 7 is this triangle over here. So before the tariff was imposed and the price was PW, consumers were feeling pretty good because they had areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Producers were not too happy because all they had was area 7 over here. Now that the price went up to PW plus T, at least domestic producers will be able to capture Area 3 over here. So Area 3 is a transfer from domestic consumers to domestic producers. And now consumer surplus at PW plus T is only 1 plus 2. So we've got Area 1 and Area 2 that are still part of consumer surplus. Area 3 and Area 7 are part of domestic producer surplus. And maybe what we want to do is account for Areas 4, 5, and 6. So let's go ahead and do that. What are areas 4, 5, and 6? Well, there's areas that the domestic consumers have lost, right? Because they were part of consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve and above the price. But it's going to take us a little bit of work to think about what each one of these are. So I guess I'll give it up. 4 is what we call a deadweight loss to the more efficient foreign producers. So you have to imagine that when the price was PW, there were people out there that were happy to supply somewhere in some other country. They were happy to supply enough of this good at PW, but now they've been boxed out of the market because the price has risen from PW to PW plus T. So they've lost out. Domestic consumers have lost out as well. And then 6 over here is a deadweight loss to domestic consumers in the importing country. Why is that? Because before, when the price was PW, QDD was the quantity that was demanded. Now that the price is PW plus T, QDD with the tariff is the quantity demanded. So this area has been lost by domestic consumers. And 5 is tariff revenue. Anytime a tariff is imposed, it creates revenue for the government. So why is this tariff revenue? Well, because the difference between PW plus T and PW is just T, right? If we subtract PW from PW plus T, we're left with T. So this distance is the tariff per unit. Well, if we multiply the tariff per unit by the new amount being imported, what is the new amount being imported? It's the difference between domestic quantity demanded with the tariff and domestic quantity supplied with the tariff. So imports is now this area over here. If we multiply the tariff per unit times the amount imported, that'll give us the total amount of tariff revenue that the government is creating, is generating from this. All right, I'm going to stop it here, folks. We will talk about a quota and finish up international trade. Thank you.